There are a couple of benefits that open source software can bring to government. At a basic level, in many cases, open source software can save the government money. Open source software is a great way to deliver innovation that is happening out in the larger community, deliver that into government in a really efficient way. But the third and I think most interesting benefit that open source can bring to government is it's a concrete way of engaging citizens. Through open source projects, citizens, developers as users of open source software can work with their counterparts in government to actually improve government services. There are a number of hurdles to using open source software in the government, some of them real and some of them imagined. In some cases, not nearly as often as, say, 10 years ago, but in some cases you'll have agencies who have explicit policies which prevent or disincent the use of open source software, which is a real shame. Earlier I mentioned all the benefits that open source software can bring, and in many cases agencies, mostly out of just not completely understanding how open source software works or how it could be consumed, they don't allow it, or they make their staff jump through hoops in order to use it. So there are policies that make it difficult to consume open source software, and there's also an acquisitions process which can sometimes prevent the easy use of open source software. And there's also a lot of uncertainty around how the government can not just consume open source software, but actually get involved in open source software projects. There's some notable exceptions and kind of success stories how that works. One of them is the National Health Information Network and the Connect project. There's collaborations that Red Hat, as an example, have done with the US Navy and IBM and Raytheon on making improvements to the Linux kernel. Those are some great examples of the government not just consuming software but actually participating in it, and I think a lot of agencies don't understand how they can replicate that same success. The first is to ensure that a given agency has a policy that, like the Defense Department, has put open source software on under the same evaluation scheme as regular commercial software, right? I think an agency shouldn't discriminate against a piece of software because of how it was developed. They ought to be evaluating it based on the end product. So, is it supportable? Is it maintainable over the long term? Is it going to leave the government up the creek without a paddle? If a company goes out of business, all these same criteria should be applied to open source software as commercial software, and we shouldn't dismiss open source software out of hand just because it was developed by a community. I think another thing we can do to make it easier is have some clearly defined engagement rules so that if a government agency does want to sponsor an open source project or participate in an existing open source project, there should be some clear guidelines for that. There should be a list of approvals that you need to get. Right now, it doesn't happen very often, and I think it's because people don't completely understand the process that they need to go through in their particular agency in order to kind of capture all the innovation that's happening in the community. The state of open source in government right now is actually outstanding. The difference between even 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 10 years ago is really striking. It's very infrequently do we run into departments or agencies that dismiss open source out of hand. That still happens sometimes, but I think people generally accept open source software as a perfectly legitimate and sometimes superior way of developing software, which is incredible. You're seeing agencies embracing not just the consumption of open source software, but again, the participation in the communities, and they're finding that that is a much more effective way to solve some of their problems than they had previously anticipated, or ways that they had been doing it previously. As far as what happens in the future, I think you're definitely going to see, especially with initiatives like data.gov, especially with a very openness-friendly, you have the Open Government Directive and the principles in it of transparency, collaboration, and participation. I think there's a lot that open source can offer an initiative like that, and so you're going to see agencies not just becoming comfortable with consuming open source software, but they're also going to be comfortable participating in the communities and the government actually cooperating with its citizens through the means of the open source development process.